Welcome to the Learning to Die podcast.
I'm Ian Dunican.
And I'm Kieran O'Regan.
How do I live when I know I must die?
We explore areas of philosophy, psychology, martial arts, culture, existential risk, history, society, religion, science, and anything else that seems of interest and relevance to answering that question.
We can only hope that some of what we learn might be of benefit to you too. Namaste, sapiens. Welcome back to the Learning to Die podcast. Today I am joined by Caitlin Duffy, who joins us from the east coast of the US of A. Caitlin, whereabouts in the US of A are you based?
I'm in Long Island, New York.
Long Island, New York.
Yeah. In Nassau County, if anyone knows that much about the New York counties.
New York County. You don't have as strong as a Long Island accent as some other people who I know.
Oh, thank you. I hear it differently sometimes, but I know what you're talking about. Yeah, it could be very thick, but I think some words I might have it. So I apologize in advance.
No, that's okay. I can barely speak English. That's fine. Full disclosure, how I came across Caitlin was actually not Caitlin's dad through the sleep science world. And interesting enough, I met Caitlin's dad, I think, on Twitter and from podcasts, he started following me. And it's a great, like, you know, for all the evil of Twitter, we'll say, right? It's actually a great way to connect with some like-minded people as well. And so you can choose your own adventure on Twitter if you like. But I started talking to Caitlin's dad on Twitter, Brendan. And Brendan was on my other podcast, Sleep for Performance. And the first time I met Caitlin's dad was face-to-face was probably in, I think, 2019. At World Sleep in Vancouver, and he'd been texting me to come on down. He said, we'll have a coffee first. And as I walked in the doors at the big convention center, he was like, you know, some cloak and dagger spy in the corner. He was over there in jeans and a shirt and a jacket. Hey, Dr. Dunican, what you doing? He recognized me coming in. And I said, Brendan, if you were in the mafia, I would have been shot. Like, I didn't even see you in the corner. and let's go get a coffee somewhere out here. I was like, what's all the cloak and dagger stuff for? So he had that classic thick Long Island accent. So that's why you don't sound as strong as Brendan.
Yeah. Well, I guess so. My dad and my mom moved out to Florida right before they had me. So I spent part of my childhood in Florida, and then they moved back to Long Island. So I feel like maybe that ruined me for having a real Long Island accent like my parents.
Well, you have a lot to live up to today because your dad is your dad's quite funny. One of the funniest stories he told on the podcast, which I love, was about the benefits of working nights as a sleep tech when he first started. It was great because he could, you know, go to the baseball games with his son, he said, or hang out with his kids during the day. He said the bad part was he looked like a vagrant because he was so tired, and people were putting quarters in his coffee cup. He's hey, I'm watching my kids' game. I'm not a vagrant. So yeah, he's got a lot of that Irish humor in him as well, as a lot of East Coast Americans do. So yeah, quite good. But we're not here to talk about your dad. If we did, we would probably get banned off the internet. So I'm sure you could tell us lots of stories. But Caitlin, tell us a little bit about yourself, about your background growing up, because you obviously did it for context. You did a PhD in the area of, I suppose, literature and in horror genres and stuff like this. So what was your kind of path growing up to get into this? Because it's definitely not a traditional path. Whatever about people take weird and wonderful paths in science, but how did you get to this? How did you get in this journey?
Yeah, that's actually a good question that I don't really have a great answer for. I was a big theater kid growing up. So I was obsessed with musical theater and plays and everything. But I was also always really, really into Halloween and horror films. Horror books too. I got into R.L. Stine, who wrote a lot of this like young adult horror fiction. So I think it was sort of there for me, the beginnings of what I would eventually grow up to do. My PhD is in English literature, but my focus was in American Gothic and American horror. So that was sort of there for me. I think too, my theater background sort of helped because it got me really interested in stories and characters and doing real deep dives into these fictional worlds too, because as an actor, and I did a little directing too, I tried it out when I was in college. But so yeah, as an actor, as a director, you really do have to really know a text in and out. And I just sort of discovered when I was an undergrad as a theater major that was sort of my favorite part, all the prep work. And I did love being on stage, but it was really the prep work that I really sunk my teeth into. And then, yeah, I just down the road, I wound up teaching at a high school. I learned that as an English literature PhD, all you would be doing is that deep dive into fiction and analyzing it and talking about it with other people, and that I could focus on horror and the Gothic. And so, yeah, I went for it.
It's going to be a dark conversation, so I turned on the light here. It's still very early here where I am. So you said you had a bit of a fascination with Halloween. It's interesting, like, 'cause Halloween's probably bigger in the US than it is anywhere else.
Yeah.
What was your fascination with Halloween, do you think? Where did that come from?
I don't know. I mean, I guess it's tied a little bit to theater probably, because it is like I got to dress up as a character and sort of be that character all night. I mean, so there's that. As a kid also, you get a lot of candy because you go trick-or-treating. So what's not to love about that? But I think too, there's just something in me that I just always, I was and still am a bit of a scaredy cat, honestly, but there's something inside me that just always gravitated towards, like, as much of a scaredy cat as I was and am, I love getting scared like that, I guess, like in a safe fictional environment. I love that feeling. And yeah, I just think it's fascinating. It's sort of like, on Halloween, the mundane everyday world turns into this sort of fantastical place where everyone's a superhero or a monster and sort of gets to live out that fantasy for a day. And I always loved that.
And so I find this interesting. I don't know do you know much about the history of Halloween?
A little bit. I know, I believe it started in Ireland, right? And it came over here.
So it started in Ireland, and I would recommend, I'll put it in the show notes. There's a very good podcast by a guy called Johnny Dillon, who was recently on our podcast, and he runs the folklore department at University College Dublin. And Johnny's got a background in philosophy and history, and he runs a podcast that goes into all these Irish history things. And it's the title's in Irish, so I'm not going to pronounce it.
Okay.
But it's very, very good. And he did an episode on Halloween. And basically what Halloween is what's called Samhain, Samhain. And Samhain is the month of November in the Irish language. But Halloween is very different in Ireland. And you're right, that's exactly where it originated. And it was basically like at the end of autumn, it was like a preparation for winter. And we have big, massive bonfires in Ireland, which was very prevalent when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s. You would have massive bonfires. And that was basically what would happen, hundreds of years ago. People would take up all the sort of the leftovers from agriculture, if you want to call it that, from all the harvesting, and they would light these big fires and have a big festival, and they would have very much like autumn fruits like apples and pears and nuts and so on. And it was to signify the end of that season, and then to move into the winter, which was obviously a very dark period. Which will be November, December, and January in Ireland. But it also signified the crossing over from the 31st of October to the 1st of November, which is All Souls Day, where they believe that basically this world and the dark world actually met. And so it was kind of to marry up with that, a bit like, was El Dia de Muerte in the Mexican culture as well, the Day of the Dead. So you see a lot of these things similarly around the end of October into November, which signifies this change, which is a little bit of a crossover into the area of chronobiology where I work in, when we talk about seasonality, from growth and, from birth, growth, death, rebirth type of thing. You see this in the seasons as well. So it's interesting that stories will hang themselves off these, we'll say, natural cycles in the world. And this is something I've seen a lot as well, which we'll talk about today in sleep mythology, which I think will have a bit of crossover as well. So yeah, I think but Halloween in the US is very different. Like we wouldn't have the pumpkins in America that are cut out.
Oh yeah, the jack-o'-lanterns.
Yeah, so that's actually in Ireland. That would be, and we didn't have that really growing up. That's a very much an American thing. But if what that was actually done from, or what that's based upon in Ireland, we would have actually cut out turnips.
I've seen photos of that, and those look way spookier than pumpkins do.
I tell you what's really spooky. Have you ever looked up photographs of people dressing up for Halloween about 100 years ago in Ireland?
No.
They will frighten the living fucking shit out of you. Yeah, I will show you. I'll bring up a picture now because it's worth looking at, because it's absolutely it's horrifying. When you bring up those pictures, you're like, Jesus Christ, that's like that if you want to be scared, this is something to look at. And it's interesting because we have had so much commercialization of Halloween globally. You know, that it's interesting to see the change in what happened. And some of these pictures, I remember showing my wife last year, they were really, she was like, oh my God, that is horrendous. How can any kid do that? And these are based upon real pictures. Like this isn't a joke. So let me, there's actually you can actually buy a poster of one of them. How scary is that?
Oh, wow.
See things like this. But there's even worse ones. There's even worse ones. It's like big pumpkin heads on the kids. Oh. There's even worse ones I've seen going around. I'm just trying to see if I can get one here, because there was a couple going around there. Oh, here's my favorite one. See that?
Ooh, yeah. So simple, but so creepy.
This is from look at that.
Oh. Yeah, I don't like that.
Yeah, it's not actually nice. So compared to like how people dress up now for parties and so on. Yeah. That was in 1933 in Dublin. So yeah, actually quite scary. So
yeah, I would turn away.
That's what I was like. I'm surprised you have a fascination with Halloween if that's the case. But anyway, but it is quite different. And that holiday really doesn't really exist here in Australia. It's only in the last maybe 5 or 10 years that kids go out and do it.
Yeah.
But there's definitely no bonfires here. It's very, very kind of, kids go out from like between 5 and 6 in the evening. That's it, with their parents.
Oh, okay.
So it's interesting. It's very different everywhere we go.
Definitely.
So anyway, again, we digress. We'll digress many times, I think. So you ended up in this area around theatre and literature, and then you decided to do a PhD. So how does somebody go about doing a PhD in literature? How does that work?
Yeah, it's a little different from doing a PhD in science or math, I imagine, because we aren't really doing like science or collecting, traditional types of data, I guess. I got my PhD at Stony Brook on Long Island, and it's more renowned, I guess, for its science. It's definitely a big science school. So there was a lot of science PhD students who I definitely had to explain exactly what I was doing there. So how it goes is my program is different. An English PhD program is going to be different from school to school, state to state, country to country. But there are some similarities. So I think I will probably sound familiar perhaps to other English Lit students out there. At Stony Brook, we were funded for 5 years. A lot of people, I think maybe even most people, tend to take more than 5 years in an English Lit program. I was fortunate enough to actually be able to finish on time, which was my goal when I found out that was my funding. But it goes basically your first 2 years, you take classes. So you take 4 semesters worth of courses. In your 3rd year is when you take your oral exam, ideally that first semester of your 3rd year. And the oral exam is you choose 3 different areas to become an expert in. Usually it's 2 periods or 2 genres even. So yeah. What I wound up doing was 19th century American literature and 19th century British literature. And then for your 3rd list, you usually do like a theory or like some sort of approach So for my third list, I did something weird because I wanted my dissertation to be connecting 19th century Gothic with modern day horror. So for my third list, I did a mix of film theory and horror films, as well as what's called neoliberal theory. So I was looking into politics, basically, so sort of a political science approach to things. I wound up looking at liberalism in the 19th century and how it's become this and morphed into this neoliberal version of government. And I looked at that all through Gothic and horror. So yeah, the oral exam, it's 1 hour for each list, and it's an oral exam, so it's spoken, and each professor gets their turn and they can ask any question they want. You're expected to know and have read all of the books on your list. There's usually around 80 titles on each list, and those could be poems, but they could also be huge Victorian novels. So it's pretty wild. And you have to be ready for anything. I will say I was really stressed out and nervous, but it wound up being a lot better than I thought it would be, because part of the benefit of, one of the good things is that you meet with your committee members, the professors who are testing you. So I sort of had a sense of what they liked, what they were interested in, what sort of questions they might ask. So I was ready to go. And certain things too, like I knew I didn't want to, I read Moby Dick, but I knew I didn't want to talk about Moby Dick, but it had to be on my 19th century American list.
Yeah.
So I had like my Moby Dick talking points, but I also knew like, oh, I can redirect, because I know my professor wants to talk about this with Moby Dick. I can say this one sentence about it and then redirect to something I'm more interested in.
You work the room. You work the room. That's what.
Yeah, exactly. And then, then once you pass that, the second semester of your third year, you do your proposal, which is where you propose your dissertation. You build your dissertation committee, which is usually the same people as who are on your oral exam. I was a little different because I discovered I wanted to stick with American Gothic. So I dropped the 19th century British fiction and I picked up 18th century American fiction. So I went with that. I proposed it, passed that, and then you have 2 years to edit the dissertation. And then it all culminates in your defense where you present what you've written. And then again, you're asked questions for about an hour, but it's a public event. So anyone can show up and anyone can ask you questions at the very end. I'm glad no one did. I feel like I stared daggers at my family and friends who came when it was open to anyone wants to ask a question. And then that's it. And all through this too, at least at Stony Brook, you start as a teaching assistant, but then in your third year, once you're getting ready for the oral exams, you're able to become an adjunct. So I was able to teach one class a semester for 3 years, which I really loved.
Did you find that the teaching actually helped you in terms of what you wanted to do, or did it detract and take away time?
It definitely can take away time, especially with English literature. And I taught a writing class too one semester, just because of the grading and the amount of student work you have to read, especially when it's a bigger class. But I discovered after talking to some other English PhD students that a good way of getting around it is assigning the books that you're writing about in your dissertation or that you were studying for your exam, because you got to read them anyway. And then in a sense, teaching becomes sort of like a study session. Yeah. And I found too that sometimes my students would say these genius things that I didn't know. And I'd be like, oh, yes, that's wonderful. And then I'd be running to my notebook to jot down what the genius thing they just said. So yeah, and I was really lucky too, because some of the classes, even the intro level classes I taught, we could be really creative with the text we did or the focus. So like one of the classes I taught was intro to fiction. So I was able to do intro to fiction, but we're just doing American Gothic. And then I also taught intro to film, but we're just going to do horror movies in this class. So that worked out. And I think it worked out for the students too, just because that's what I was really focused in. So I think, that helped me be a better teacher than if I did like a true attempt at like, here is introduction to film, and we're going to do like all the Criterion Collection movies that I don't specialize in.
So, Caitlin, you said there about teaching, like about tips for writing or teaching writing and these different areas. In today's world, we're going very much like, I'd say, visual, like lots of YouTube or lots of audio, and people are like doing voice memos, and people are not very much. People don't really write with a pen and paper. And I got a little notebook and pen here as we talk, but I still like that kind of tactile feeling of doing it. But do you think that writing is actually, the art of writing is dying or getting better in society?
I think it's getting. I think we're progressing. I think we're shifting. I don't know if I want to say better. I also don't think we're getting worse at the same time.
So let me ask you this: different. How is it changing? We'll say, is it getting better or worse? How is it changing?
Yeah, and I think it's changing digitally, because I think we have so many more means of communication. I mean, I always counted in my classes and also just in my own mind, I count podcasting as a sort of writing, honestly. And in fact, in my classes, for some assignments, I would let students choose what type of research paper they wanted to submit, whether that be a traditional paper, a podcast episode, a YouTube style video, because at the end of the day, they're still writing down somewhere, like their notes, they're still doing the analysis I wanted them to do. They're still communicating their ideas. And I think in today's world, I feel like that's sort of a realistic skill a skill that they realistically should have in their back pocket, how to write for, or write outlines for a podcast or a YouTube video or something, or a blog. So yeah, I think it's different, not necessarily better or worse. And there's more options too, because the way like images and video and sound can interact with the written word, I think it just opens up a lot more opportunities.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And it's interesting that you talk about podcasting or blogs as like a form of writing, where traditionally I wouldn't have actually said that. And not that I'm any English literature guru or anything like that. Far from it. I actually have a lot of trouble with writing. I think that's why I like kind of science engineering type, because it's very structured in its approach. And I find it difficult. I do write with a pen for a kind of a journal, which I won't do every single day, but it's just kind of like when I need to vomit out words out my head and just clear my head, I will go and just write probably like a crazy person in this journal. But it's not something I'm very creative at or good at doing. But it's interesting for you to talk about that, because that's what I try to do with my Sleep for Performance podcast. Shameless plug there for that podcast. But
nice.
I've done over 100 episodes of that. And sometimes people go to me, oh, you could grow the podcast this way, and you could do this and you could do that. I'm like, I'm not really interested. That's like my one-on-one professional development, because it's very selfish, because people give me an hour or two of the time where I get to tease apart their paper or a bunch of papers. And for me, it's like, that's professional development. So when I go into my day-to-day job as a consultant or as an academic writing papers, an adjunct academic, I'm like, oh, I remember talking to blah, blah, blah about that paper. I'll go and look at this literature. So, you know what I mean? So for me, like what you did with the teaching, it's perfect, because I don't have to go to lots of conferences. I don't have to read lots of stuff. I'm getting this distilled message and I'm putting it out there as well. And if people want to listen to it, they can, but it is a form then or of information source. And like with this podcast, Karen and I started this podcast about a year ago to look at these topics. And the reason I started this, because I was interested in it, but I was going to go back and do like a master's in philosophy and history. But then I was like, if I do that, maybe I'm just going to burden myself with topics and put myself under pressure. I'm really busy anyway. And then I was been chatting to Karen and was like, oh, do you want to do a podcast? And we'll explore these topics we're interested in. And it's been absolutely brilliant, because we've done about, I don't know, I think you'll be like episode 31 or 32. Oh, wow. And so it's like 60 or 70 hours already, not to mention all the hours that Karen and I spend. But it's also actually promoted me to go and read different books.
Yeah.
So now I got a whole new bookshelf of like, I'm just looking over now, I've got like Plato, Rousseau, Nietzsche.
Oh, wow.
Like stuff on Newgrange in Ireland, like history, I got Fairy Tales from Ireland, The Red Book by Carl Jung, Maps of Meaning by Jordan Peterson, The Dreaming Path, an Aboriginal book, Greek mythology, a book about Jim Morrison, the Bible, Carl Jung's Aeon, Quantum Questions. It's just like
wow.
that wouldn't have happened if I went to university. Like, I don't think I would have got that big, wide spread. And so, you know, I think it's good in terms of, you know, these different, let's say, formats or process can push us out and learn different things. Now, that sounds, you might say, oh, wow, that's impressive, but that's not half as impressive you having to read 80 books for each topic. Tell me about how you got through those books. That is a lot of time. Like, what was your life like? Did you just put yourself into a box with a torch and a
sort of?
Yeah, like how did you do that? That's crazy.
Well, it's so, and to be fair, so one of my lists was half of the list was horror films. So I feel like I was maybe one of the lucky ones, because I still had, like, if there was a day where I had to work on this list, or like I set aside time to study and I didn't feel like reading, I could just put on Psycho or something and it counted as studying. So I feel like that helped. The other thing too is one of my professors told me, enjoy this time, because this is the probably only and definitely last time your job will be to read and watch movies. Like, that is your job. You're not expected to produce an article yet or a book or anything. You're just supposed to read and digest. So take advantage of that. And I did my best, and I did enjoy it. There are parts of it that I enjoyed. Stressful, yes, because I had to figure out a system of taking notes. And that took me a while to figure out, because I'm the sort of person who thinks everything is interesting, everything is important. So the note taking slowed me down, and I was trying to keep everything organized so I could return to it. And then I read Vanity Fair for my first time, because that was on my list, and I just loved it so much that I was purposefully reading it slowly, which was a really dumb idea. But eventually I found out, I wound up actually blogging my entire, all of my notes and my whole experience of studying. And it was sort of reminded me of what you were saying about your podcast, that it was really just for me, but I didn't make it private because I thought, why not? And what was really cool was that it was wound up getting way more viewers than I thought would ever look at my study notes, including people whose theories I was reading and studying, like a bunch of professors who I was reading their text for these lists. And then I eventually cited in my dissertation, commented on my blog, which is really cool, in a nerdy kind of way, I guess. So yeah, that's sort of how I did it. I wasn't able to get to the exam the first semester, which is what I was pushing for. I had to wait till the second semester, but I still got it done in the end. But yeah, especially with that British 19th century list, that one was what really killed me, because all of those books are like 800, 900 pages. And just
So what's some of the books in that British literature from the 1800s that we might be familiar with today that have still passed the test of time?
Let's see, I could actually get my list up right here. Let's see. Well, definitely Vanity Fair was on there.
Haven't read it.
Oh, it's not letting me open it.
You read them out and I'll tell you if I've read them or not. We'll see how bad I am at fiction. I love being bad at things.
Well, Dracula was on there.
I read it. I read that book. I read that book in the middle of my PhD and I was like, oh my God, this book is unbelievable. I couldn't believe it. I was raving. I must have bought 30 copies and handed them out to people. I'm like, this still stands up. Over 100 years, this book stands up. And I went on a fascination with Dracula. So I've read Dracula. Yeah. Keep going with your list and we'll see what else I haven't read.
Frankenstein?
No.
What else do I have on there? Jane Eyre was on there.
No.
Wuthering Heights.
No.
Tenant of Wildfell Hall.
Never heard of it.
What else is on there? So long. I can see like the covers. Actually, I have them right here. I could cheat. Oh no, these are my Americans. I had what's his name? H. Haggard. What's his name? H. Rider Haggard, who wrote King Solomon's Mines. He wrote all the Quartermain novels.
No.
And that was a Quartermain novel. That was good. I read a few Sherlock Holmes short stories.
No.
I think I said Jekyll and Hyde already. Some H.G. Wells as well, but all short stories. I don't think I read War of the Worlds for this list.
Terrible. Right. So the next question is, Caitlin, why should people read fiction? How can fiction benefit them? Because I'm one of those people who's very much nonfiction. If I'm reading stuff, it's history, philosophy, some sort of political thing, or like the intersectionality between politics and war and history. I really like that sort of stuff. So how would fiction benefit me? I think there's one fiction book I'm trying to read at the moment, Dostoevsky, The Idiot.
I haven't read any of those Russian novels.
Yeah, that's quite good, but it's hard.
Russian.
It's hard to read, but it's good. And I'd like to have a bit more time. It's kind of like on the beach on holidays type of book. I've read Dracula, and I reckon that's the only two fiction books I can recall off the top of my head in the last 10 years. So how would fiction benefit me?
Okay. Yeah, I think there's two main things come to my head right off the bat. So the first one is the more bubblegummy type answer, which is just that it's fun. It's good escapist fun. And I'm a big proponent in reading what's fun for you and what you love. Like, don't force yourself to read anything, or don't feel guilty about reading something. I'm in a book club right now where we purposely choose sort of like, we're reading all these romance novels, and it's great fun because it's me and a few former PhD students. So we're used to reading these like heady novels. But yeah, we have this super fun book club. So we're enjoying that. So that's one thing. Read what you love and just have fun with it. And the other thing is more about like empathy. I think the New York Times had an article about this a year or two ago, that fiction readers in general have greater empathy or powers of empathy than nonfiction readers. And the reason is because you're constantly entering into another person's mind. You're constantly sort of thinking about what it would be like to be in this other person's shoes. You're often sometimes put in a first person's perspective, or even like a second or third person perspective. And in the third person's perspective, you're given this sort of task of seeing what multiple people are experiencing or feeling, or at least being given these sort of clues based on what they say or what they do. So I think that's really important. And I think too, thinking about these more historical texts, and one thing I feel I benefited from is sometimes they do reference real historical events or technologies or tools or beliefs. So I feel like I've gone down the rabbit hole quite a few times because of fiction. It's taught me so much that is nonfiction in this really sort of immersive way, because I'm living through this individual story.
That's interesting. It's not only escapism, but it allows you to put yourself like nearly in the superhero suit of that person. You also remind me as well, like Jordan Peterson has said this, that sometimes fiction is truer than truth, because it allows you to actually just show what people are capable of or what goes on. But it also gives you that kind of container to explore these things. Whereas in a history, book or something, or some sort of factual book, if you want to call it that, people will go, oh, that never happened. Or what about this other opinion? But in fiction, there doesn't have to be that conflicting factor. It can be just like, well, that's just what it is in this container. So it allows you to explore that, which is interesting, because I often find it interesting how some scientists or other people will cross over and write fiction. Like one of Carl Sagan's books was Contact, which became a massive movie with Jodie Foster and Matthew McConaughey.
Oh wow!
And it's completely wild about like a form of galactic space travel and time travel, I suppose you want to call it that. I don't know if you've ever seen that. It was made in the 90s.
No, but I'll definitely check that out.
Very, very good. Matthew McConaughey and Jodie Foster. It puts all those kind of And obviously Carl Sagan was a very famous, physicist and cosmologist in the US and globally. But this book was a novel. It's like, wow, how do you go from like that to that? It's interesting.
Yeah.
And there's been a number of scientists that have done that to allow them to basically use that container to explore ideas.
There's a lot of them out there, actually. I was surprised by how many.
But even like an everyday account is in Star Trek, the original Star Trek that was out in the 60s and 70s with William Shatner. Like Motorola, who made the first flip phone, they based their idea off the Star Trek little walkie-talkies that used to flip open.
Oh, wow.
There's loads of examples. Yeah, there's loads of examples like that where fiction or drama or theater has basically influenced what we have today. The other recent one that comes to mind is the Minority Report with Tom Cruise, which was only like, I don't know, 15 years ago or something. And I don't know, it's definitely between 15 and 20 years. And it was basically iPads and that where people were swiping left and right and looking at stuff on tablets. And next minute, like, within 5 or 6 years, that was available via, Apple and Samsung. And it's like, okay, did that influence that? Or did they know it was coming? Like, it's interesting how these a container of fiction, whether it be writing or TV or whatever, can actually be very powerful and influencing what we do, whether it be science fiction or horror, whatever it might be. It's kind of fascinating how it impacts our life.
Yeah, there's a few famous examples of that. Going to my 19th century American text that I studied, there's quite a few, especially around the American Civil War. So not a doctor, but Walt Whitman, a lot of Walt Whitman's poetry really helped, especially in terms of discovering what PTSD was. But there was another writer who was a doctor, and he was Civil War era doctor, and he treated Civil War patients or soldiers. His name was Silas Weir Mitchell. And he wound up writing a bunch of short stories, including this one really creepy, so obviously it's my favorite, this one really creepy short story. And he actually is credited with discovering or proving phantom limb pain, or like phantom pain. So when you get a limb amputated and you still feel it. So the story he wrote is all about this Civil War soldier who gets a limb amputated. I don't remember all the specifics, and also I don't want to spoil it for anyone, but it basically asks this question, like the limbs have sort of a life of their own, and he becomes basically haunted by his own body parts. And it sort of asks this question too of like, where does the soul live in the body? Because, is the soul is it like everything? And if I cut off my hand, is there a soul, like a part of my soul? Is it in this hand?
Yeah.
So the story has this really creepy concept of like, you've lost part of your soul, and now that part of your soul is going to haunt you.
Well, that's very interesting, because this is where I love doing podcasts like this, because it actually, we come at some similar things at different angles. Ian McGilchrist, who've spoken on this podcast before, who actually did classics at Oxford originally, I think, and then became a neuroscientist and psychiatrist, and practiced as a psychiatrist in the US and I think in the UK. Now he's a writer, and he's written this book called The Matter with Things, and it's 2 volumes, and it's about 2,000 pages combined. They're sitting here in the bookshelf. I'm about 60 pages into the first one, but it's one of those books like what you said. You like it so much, you nearly read it line by line and sit back and think about it and take notes. And I'm under no rush like to finish it, so I'm going to take my time and enjoy it. But Ian talks about this as well. This kind of thing about, we're very materialistic in terms of matter, rationalist, and so on. But what about all these other things that we can't really measure, like the soul, or where is the mind? And everybody kind of thinks like, it's interesting. I did a talk last week about this, a similar topic about like sleep and dreams, and everybody thinks the mind is in the brain. And like every hand shoots up, like, it's in the brain. Oh, we know that. Like, well, no, we don't actually. Oh, I thought that was proven. No, it doesn't. If that was the case, then, if you feel sad, it would only be in your head, but why does your body feel like, achy and weak and so on? So this kind of bi-directional relationship, or this integrated approach of the soul and the mind and the body. Yeah. So it makes complete sense that when something is missing, literally a part of you is missing, maybe a part of you has gone in that respect. So it's no surprise to me that, I think we're a more integrated being than we know. And so, I think that's a very interesting, very interesting.
that's a whole field in literature studies too, like mind body soul studies, and then that branches off into affect studies, and which is like sort of emotions, but also how emotions are felt in the body. And yeah, there's a whole field in this. And in the 19th century, this was a big deal, I guess, because there was so much work and discovery being done with the brain, which actually, the article I had published on Dracula deals with this, with 19th century brain science, because you could definitely tell that Bram Stoker was influenced by a lot of the brain science of his day.
Yeah, there's a great book about Bram Stoker. I don't know if you've read it. I ended up buying it a few years ago, and I think I read about 3/4 of it. It was basically about Bram Stoker. It was like a biography on him. I don't know if it comes up. Oh yeah, Something in the Blood.
No, I haven't read that one.
This
like
one here.
The title though.
Something in the Blood, cool. The Untold Stoker of Bram Stoker, the man who wrote Dracula.
Huh.
It's quite an interesting book. David J. Skal, Skal, if I'm pronouncing that right. Very, very interesting book. Quite thick as well. It's got, as you see, there are 672 pages. I read most of that book. It's quite interesting because for people who don't know, Bram Stoker was actually Irish. He was an Irish Protestant. He went to Trinity College. I believe he did literature or something along those lines and philosophy. And what's interesting is I went to view Bram Stoker's office. He worked in Dublin Castle as an administrator, and I went to there, and under Dublin Castle there is like old Viking ruins from that time. So basically, like within 20 feet of Bram Stoker's office, underneath there is like old ruins of the city there around the times of the Vikings. Wow. So it's a very interesting place, but also as well, you start seeing the influence of Irish culture onto Dracula. And a lot of people don't realize that Dracula was written by an Irish author. And he was obviously around. He worked for, Bram Stoker worked for this other guy who was an actor and used to go around like as an aide to him. And so he was very much exposed to, set design, theater, all these kind of elements that you've discussed earlier on. But the word Dracula is actually an Irish word. Did you notice?
No.
Yeah, so it actually comes from the Irish word meaning Druc Ula, which actually means bad blood.
Whoa! No, yeah. I had no idea.
That's where the word Dracula has been derived from. So a lot of people think it's some sort of like, Central European author and some sort of word, but Dracula comes from bad blood, and this is where, and you can see it actually here in this, because in the little abstract here for this book, he talks about with bad blood that pervades Dracula. So Druc Ula would be the Irish word. So it means bad blood. So yeah, there is some Irish influence in it, but it's still fascinating, this book, because it's lasted over 100 years. It's still relevant today. And people I give it to who have never read it are like, wow, like this book is crazy. And it's got very, very different writing style, like with letters in it and then from different perspectives and so on. And it's really like broken into 3 parts, I suppose. There's the Transylvania part of in the mountains, and then there's the part of the journey across to London, and then there's the part in London. So it's like this trilogy. And it's really fascinating, and I couldn't put it down. My heart was racing reading it. And I was like, wow, this is probably the best book I've ever read, and I still say that. What makes a book so good that it can last and test the test of time? Because this is, I can't understand it. I can't understand why it's so good.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I knew the answer to that, because then I would write my own. But it's an amazing book, and it really does hold up. It feels very modern, even though it's set in Stoker's present day. But I think one thing that always stood out to me too was how it's in the what's called the epistolary form, which just means that it's written through letters, diary entries. I think there's a newspaper article in there at one point. So it's like a collection, almost like a scrapbook. And what I really like to think about is comparing Dracula to like found footage horror movies today, where like Blair Witch Project, where when you sit down in that theater or at home and you put the movie on, it tells you oh, this is the videotape we recovered and we never found the bodies. It's sort of doing a similar thing in Dracula, where it's here's these letters and diary entries. But I also like thinking about too is we don't know which character necessarily put all those together at the end. Like, who is the fictional editor in that story? I always think it's Mina Harker who put it all together in the end, but it's sort of unclear. And I'm sure there's academic debates out there that I haven't discovered. But I like thinking about that too, because that's something I think about with found footage horror movies like Blair Witch. Who in the fictional world are we supposed to be believing edited this, and why did they choose these particular, with Dracula, why these particular letters in this order? I mean, obviously the order is because that's the story, but also like, why did we switch narrators in this moment? And is there a letter that's been left out perhaps? So I like thinking about that. And then also I think that helps make the story so exciting because it's so immediate. You are fully in there. It's almost like when you hold Dracula, you're holding this collection of letters. It's a tangible material thing from the story itself, in the same way that Blair Witch back in the day, in the 90s, I guess, when you rented it on VHS from Blockbuster, it's that tape. And it sort of feels like you've got the thing from the movie right there. And what's weird too is that it forces you to realize you are reading something. You are reading a letter. In most books, they do their best to make you forget that you're reading. And in most movies, they try to make you forget you're watching a movie. But in found footage, in epistolary novels like Dracula, they're constantly reminding you you're reading a letter or you're watching this recorded footage from the woods. And somehow that makes it feel more real and more immediate. And yeah, I love talking about that sort of fiction. It's so exciting to me.
Yeah, I think as you're saying it, like I'm thinking about reflecting on reading it, and it was exactly like that. You're reading a letter and you're kind of like racing through it, and it's like these correspondence with Jonathan Harker, the main character. It's in the first, portion of the first trimester of the book, if you want to call it that. And he's like, dear Mina, blah, blah, blah. And you're reading it going, oh my God. And he's talking about, but what you can also see as well is not only you can see the gradual change in him over the letters as well. And he's losing his mind. And obviously Dracula is sucking the blood out of him gradually over time and driving him crazy.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. The other thing I read as well about Bram Stoker was basically that there was rumors that he was homosexual, and he was trying to write this into the novel as well because of the time that was very much frowned upon. And he was trying to write this in about this male kind of homoerotic type of thing that was happening as well. So these are other weird and wonderful stuff that are retrospectively kind of analyzed, but we'll never know really, what was his influences. But there seemed to be so many weird and wonderful influences. The Irish language, there was Vlad the Impaler. There was obviously around this time, Mary Shelley had written Frankenstein, similar things were going on. It was after the famine in Ireland, not too long after that. Ireland was still part of the British Empire. It was just a very kind of a confluence of factors as well. When you sit back from the book itself and look at it, you kind of think all of these things that were in it.
Yeah.
Quite bizarre. And I don't know why I'm so fascinated with it. I actually thought it was because, it was the Irish influence on it. And I was like kind of, oh, well, that's great. But why didn't I feel that way about like Jonathan Swift or other Irish authors, which I don't. But for some reason, when I talk about Dracula, I get quite excited. And I think it's because of those factors you said about it's nearly like you've picked up this forbidden book and you've blown the dust off and you're reading it going, Jesus Christ, this is like a true account. It actually makes you feel like that. Like you found something that no one else has read, even though it's like one of the best-selling books of all time.
Yeah.
That to me is like fascinating.
Other people's private correspondence. So there's sort of like a
voyeur,
I'm not supposed to be doing this. Yeah, a voyeur, which is big in present horror too. Like thinking about Psycho and like the first perspective camera in slasher movies like Halloween. It's so much is about voyeurism, and it goes right back here to Dracula a little bit, I think.
Yeah, it's crazy. So why do you think then people would be interested in horror? Because even though that's probably the only horror book I've read. I read one of Stephen King's books, The Gunslinger, from the array of books, or whatever you want to call them.
The Dark Tower.
The Dark Tower series. And I bought the rest of them when I never got a chance to read them. And then when I was moving house, I gave them away. But that was the only Stephen King I've watched. Now I've watched a lot of his movies. I absolutely love watching horror. My wife doesn't, but like recent shows that were good, I liked. That was like The Haunting of Hill House on Netflix.
Yeah.
Like that was so great. I like what you said. The more I frightened the shit out of myself, the better it was.
Yes.
And my wife was like, how do you go to bed after that? I'm like, I don't know. I said, absolutely love it. And interesting enough, my wife was away at the time and I was watching like episode 7 or something. And I was so engrossed in it that I was watching it on the iPad while I was eating my dinner in the kitchen because I just couldn't miss out. But as I did it, we just recently had our kitchen renovated at the time. And as I was eating, something happened in the show. But as that happened, the light fell out of the fitting.
Oh, no.
And so it simultaneously happened. I went, ah! And I freaked out. And I was like,
gosh.
Fuck. And so I was like, I completely frightened the shit out of myself. And then I was like, I loved it. Like said that I frightened myself so bad. So why do you think some people like to be frightened like this and kind of get this? It's nearly like, eating the chili and going, I know it burns, but I love it. Like, why do we do that, do you think?
Well, there's a lot of theories out there. I think I'm trying to find this one book that I will recommend that sort of gets at one of these possibilities. Yes. Okay. So one possibility is, and this is from the scholar Matthias Klassen, Klasen, and he wrote this book called Why Horror Seduces in 2017. He believes and he argues that horror is almost like an evolutionary tool, that it helps us, and we sort of naturally, or some of us, some humans anyway, sort of naturally like that training, I guess, that training to feel fear and sort of in this safe environment of a film or of a book or a short story or a poem or whatever, or a video game, I guess nowadays too, you can experience that fear, that death, or that fight or flight response even a little bit in a safe way. And then you're sort of training your body to react to these moments. So that's his big thing. He's really interesting. He focuses on human behavioral biology and evolutionary and cognitive psychology. And he's fascinating. I met him once at a conference and I talked his ear off because even though he is sort of in this literary field a little bit, I feel like he has 2 feet, 1 foot in literature and then 1 foot in psychology a little bit. What he does every year with his students, I think he's in Denmark, but I forget. But what he does with his students is he takes them to a haunt. So like one of those haunted houses people walk through and actors jump out at you. He takes students there and then sort of studies their reactions. And that's his data, basically, people's experiences in these interactive haunted house places. So that's one thing. I really do think that's the main thing. This you were sort of talking about this earlier too, this idea of like the container of a fictional story.
Yeah.
So I think being able to have that adrenaline rush, have that, sort of tiptoe into a sort of dangerous place, maybe do a little voyeurism, but all in sort of a safe environment of, your recliner or your couch or the movie theater. I think that's a big thing. I think that's what it is.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I just looked up Matthias there as you were saying his name. He's pretty old. He's the same age as me, so I might have to reach out to him.
He's great.
This is fascinating because it's I just looking at his PhD dissertation was in monsters and horror stories, a bicultural approach. And what you're saying there is, and he wrote that book then, Why Horror Seduces, in 2017. This is also kind of interesting because I think if he's looking at this sort of like area, but like you're saying, between science and stories, it's interesting because I did an episode on this recently on my podcast looking at sleep mythology. And last week I did a talk for a local group on basically sleep and dreams. the relationship with death and dying, which has been shown about how people see more dead people when they become closer to death from studies done in palliative care. But then how is that actually seen in religious texts as well, in terms of, in the Bible, they talk about light. In Indian culture, like Hinduism, to talk about the third eye, which is the pineal gland where melatonin is released, and so on and so on and so on, which is also where DMT is released, which they reckon is, comes out when we die. There's also a link then into like Indra's net in Buddhism, which talks about all of us being connected, which is similar to Rupert Sheldrake's morphic resonance theory. There's all this kind of connection with this as well. But the other thing as well is that in sleep science, there's a sleep disorder called sleep paralysis. But cultures have developed mythology and folklore around it. The classic one is in Newfoundland, which is called a hag, which is basically somebody sitting on your chest whilst you're asleep. And for men, it actually comes in a female form. And sometimes, for a lot of the times, actually, the female is actually, for want of a better description, is actually raping them.
Yeah.
So it's a combination of like
succubus or an incubus.
The succubus and incubus. That's exactly what it is. And so, one is a female version and one is a male version. And that's exactly what I spoke about in the slide last week, was about that, and put up a picture of this hag, but like in the Caribbean, it's called a Kokma, Kokma. And then also in places like Laos, the country, there's a sudden unexpected death syndrome where more people die of this from sleep paralysis. And the World Health Organization still doesn't know why they're dying since the 70s.
Wow.
Very high prevalence rate. So, but it's like a crushing syndrome on the chest. So how that then, in terms of a medical issue that's happening, sleep paralysis, which is this kind of like, halfway between dreaming and awake, where your body is still paralyzed, but your mind your brain is awake and you're cognizant of what's going on, but you're in this kind of half and half state. So I often think sometimes is that the scientific explanation and that's right? Or is the mythology real and we're having this physiological response from what's really happening? And so when you say that in a scientific group, people look at you and go, that's ridiculous. But in this sort of container, we'll say, for this podcast or other people, you can say that and you can look at it back the other way. And I think it's really interesting how sometimes mythology is actually constructed, or folklore or literature, to represent what's actually happened, and then serves as a more of a vehicle over time to basically transfer that story and that knowledge. I'll give you one more example. There's a place in Ireland called Newgrange in County Meath. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. And Newgrange is a massive burial chamber, really. It's 5,000 years old and was built before Stonehenge. There's a little light box in it. And on the 21st of December, at the height of the winter solstice, light shines in. And basically from the 21st of December, we start gaining light. So it's obviously some sort of archaeoastronomy. It lines up with different star systems and so on. 5,000 years ago. It's absolutely fascinating. Yeah. But in that as well, there's 3 burial areas. And when it was excavated in the 60s and 70s, they took some bones out of it and put them into storage, I think at UCD. And then a few years ago, Queen's College Belfast did some analysis on the bones. But there was a legend of that area for a long, long time about this giant, the Dogda, which, and I'll get this story wrong, so I'll just give you the kind of the cliff notes, the overview of it. Okay. But seemingly the Dogda had sex with his daughter, and then they had an offspring, so there was kind of incest to keep the bloodlines pure. When they analyzed the bones, they found actually they were related in that manner. The dad, the daughter, and the offspring were there, all related from the bones. So you got to think to yourself, well, that really did happen, right? Obviously, they weren't giants, they can tell from the bones, but were they very tall for that time, and they were classified as giants, right? So that's the other thing. Like, were they very kind of big and healthy for that time when people didn't have much food? So maybe they were kind of classified as giants. Was that a story that started off as factual, but then kind of grew legs, so to speak, over time to make it more interesting to pass it down? And that's, to me, where I'm starting over the last few months of looking at fiction, mythology, folklore are actually vehicles for our culture to keep stuff encoded and keep these stories repeating over and over again, as opposed to someone wrote a book in 1820 and then we go, well, that's been disproven, so we'll put that in the bin. You know what I mean? Because when we do it in a very kind of scientific way, we have these markers and we kind of, like in scientific method, well, that's not been proven. We've shown that, that's okay. And we're constantly moving, which is good. But the fiction seems to be this overarching, hit the microphone, this overarching kind of vehicle for stories that we can, we always have.
I think that's it. And it sort of connects back to this idea that we were talking about before with sort of scientific people becoming writers or becoming horror or sci-fi writers. And Silas Weir Mitchell, the Civil War doctor who I was talking about, who wrote that story about phantom limb syndrome. Because I think too, sometimes with mythology, but also horror fiction, especially reading older stuff, sometimes I think another reason I guess we turn to horror fiction is to explain things that maybe can't be yet put into words or can't be yet explained. And that alone is already scary in and of itself, like the unexplainable or the unuttered, right? Like a feeling that can't even be spoken. It's so bizarre or so large or whatever. And I think that's an important thing to talk about too. And on the flip side, I think horror fiction can be used as a way almost for like a political tool in a similar way, to talk about or to sort of express experiences of like identity or a moment in history like the Civil War, in a way like that otherwise might not have been something that could be fully explained or discussed in words or in a non-fictional way. There's a writer I read in my list, and I talk about him in my dissertation, Charles Chestnut, he wrote in the late 19th century. He's an American writer. And he wrote right during the Reconstruction, and he's a Black American, and he wrote these stories that were Gothic, but sort of were masqueraded as, or like sort of masked as, these plantation tales. But I think his work is a really great example. There's one story that's really good, but really tough to read almost, called Poe Sandy, Posandy. And it's basically this story about this enslaved man who keeps getting sent to other plantations. So he never has a home. He can't stay with his wife. So he talks to this woman, I think it's actually his wife, who knows conjure or like a witchcraft. And he gets turned into a tree so he could put roots down in this land and have a home and not be moved. But in the end, he gets chopped down by the plantation master and then turned into lumber. And then his body as lumber is used to build this kitchen. So it's like, it's talking about the experience of slavery, about being a human being turned into raw material for capital, not being in control of your own body, all of these issues that are huge and hard to talk about and hard to really explain. But through fiction, it's conveyed, at least, there's no way you can really convey it 100%, but I think that's really fascinating to think about how these sort of, I guess, allegories or the language of the Gothic can be used to talk about these big experiences.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because a few things jump up there as you just explained, and obviously I haven't read it, but it's interesting you want to be turned into a tree, because when you look at Carl Jung in psychology and psychiatry, the tree of life, we can't grow until we understand, the roots of the depths of the evil that we're capable of as well. So it's kind of interesting that he wants to have roots, which is probably the darkness of the slave owner, but also he wants to flourish out of that as well. But as he tries to flourish out of it, he's getting chopped down. But also then reminds me of nearly in Buddhism and Hinduism about karma and how energy can't be destroyed or dissipated, and he's just changing form or function into something else. So he still can't escape it.
Yeah.
When we talk about samsara,
Yeah. And neither can, the story ends too in this way of like, neither can America, because it ends with his soul haunting that land and that building. So it sort of ends with, that continuation and this, this thing that America has to sort of confront and correct. And that was a big point of why Charles Chestnut was writing those stories, because again, it was written during Reconstruction. So he was really arguing for like reparations and things like that.
Yeah, it's interesting because I personally feel like, you know, and this is similar to a guy called Rupert Sheldrake. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He's got a theory called morphic resonance, and Rupert must be about 80 now. He used to hang around with Terence McKenna and some other guy that had these trialogues in the 70s and 80s, but he's kind of a fringe scientist. It's always a good sign when a scientist had his TED Talk banned. So that's the kind of guy he is, Rupert. He's been on Joe Rogan's podcast. He's been on Russell Brand. He's you know, I think he did a PhD at Cambridge in biology. He's a serious scientist, but not taken seriously, I think. Okay. And he talks about these kind of, he spent a lot of time in India, and he talks about this kind of energy thing, like what you're saying there, or his theory, morphic resonance. And I think I get that feeling sometimes when you walk into somewhere. I don't know if you've ever had this. And I find like coming from Europe, you're probably more in tune with this, where you go into somewhere old and you kind of feel the energy, whether it's dark or light, and different parts of the world or different towns you go into, and you're just like, nah, there's something not right about this. Like for me, there's a few places that I go to, and it's interesting. A few of the places that I really dislike, and I won't say the names of the places, a few places I really dislike here in Western Australia are actually, when I found out recently that actually a lot of atrocities happen there with Aboriginal people. And, you know, I'm far from, we'll say, a lefty democratic socialist type protester. So it's not like I'm going around looking for things to find that went wrong, because Irish culture had as many things go wrong in it as many other cultures. You know, our Irish culture, we could spend days on this talking about, you know, and your family's probably evident of that coming from Ireland originally. You know, we've been displaced just over 800 years. But it's interesting that these different areas do give us these different energies, and how then with this guy here, Charles Chestnut, in his examples as well, how this kind of then morphs into fiction as a way to convey that again. Because I think sometimes personally we're completely out of tune with the land, because the more technologically advanced we get. And sometimes I think one of those things about any of those brief fiction books I've read from the past, or even in history, you feel like how much people were connected. And I wonder sometimes with horror fiction, are we connecting more with the kind of the night, the darkness, the unknown, the world itself, where we're kind of like, wow, this is very, because I find in horror, it's very earthy, if that's the way to describe it. It's very kind of like, wow, there's something here that we don't really know.
Things that are just lurking beyond sort of human civilization and human reach, or maybe even hiding within, like with Dracula being in London. We have this old world, or like Transylvania. That's what is that? Within the woods, Transilv.
It was set in the Carpathian Mountains in Romania, but I'm not sure what Transylvania means. Is that like a word for something else? Yeah, so trans is a prefix. I should know what this prefix means.
But Sylvan is woods or wilderness. So trans is prefix is on or on the other side of or across. So it's like it's literally then like across the woods or in the middle of the woods. So going from Transylvania to this wild place, this old world place, into modern civilized London. I think, and that's also a major thing in this one branch of horror or Gothic that tends to be referred to as Imperial Gothic. So it's this fear of like the outside of England or outside of the UK, at least in the 19th century, they're talking about the British Empire. So something out there, when we're sending someone like Jonathan Harker out there to do business and bring it back to England, sometimes that outside wilderness that the British Empire is exploring can come right back. You know, if you open the door to go out, something's going to come in.
That's interesting, because that's actually transfers into today, where people are like, I've had the great privilege of traveling to many countries, and people are like, oh, I can't believe you went to like this place in Africa, or you went to like, Kazakhstan or Cuba. I'm like, what do you mean? Oh, it's so dangerous out there. No, it's actually not. Like, I've had probably more dangerous episodes here in Perth or in Ireland than I did like in, other places. It's not like everybody's out there trying to kill you outside the veil of the Western community. So that's kind of like what goes on, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
It's quite bizarre. I think it's really interesting that you mentioned that, because this whole thing with what's kind of lurking or what's going parallel to our world is interesting. Are you familiar with the Irish folklore and fairy tales of like the Tuatha Dana, the fairies?
No.
So the fairies is spelled F-A-E-I-R-E-S, something like that. Like exactly, it's not like the fairies. And the fairies is like an underworld. It's like a dark world. And there's a whole story about how basically when I think it was when, what's the angel's name? Was it Michael that fell from heaven? And basically all these fairies came with him, and these are the Tuatha Dana, which live in the dark world at nighttime. And there's a whole host of stories in Ireland from this. A guy called Eddie Lenihan, who was doing a dissertation, a master's in arts he was doing phonetics, was traveling around Western Ireland at the time in the 70s, and he was cycling around. And as he did, he was actually collecting lots of stories from people, and he's written a number of books on it. And I'll put some links into the show notes for Eddie Lenihan. He's a storyteller, a shanachie we call in Irish. And I've spoken to Eddie a few times. He sent me over some books as well. You can buy them from him as well. He's had his books translated into like 15 different languages or something. I think recently it's been translated into Japanese, and it's been like gangbusters over there. But he writes about, he's written all these accounts of the fairies at nighttime, about all these other things that are happening. And Johnny Dillon, who was recently on the podcast, spoke about some of these things as well. These kind of underworld stories that we have at nighttime and how they've impacted our culture. There was a movie made in the 50s called Darby O'Gill and the Little People. I don't know if you've ever seen this movie.
No.
Darby O'Gill and the Little People was a Walt Disney movie, and Walt Disney actually visited the Irish folklore department in Ireland before he made this movie. This movie was probably either the first or second movie that Sean Connery ever was in.
Wow.
And if you want to be frightened the shit out of, watch this movie. It is a children's movie. It will frighten the living fucking shit out of you. I'm telling you now. I watched it maybe about 10 years ago. My wife hadn't seen it, and she was like, how is that a kid's movie? She was like, she was in bits. And when I watched it again at like 35, I was like, fuck, that is really scary. So I think it was done in the 50s. I think it was Maureen O'Hara, who was in The Quiet Man, who was a famous Irish-American actress, Sean Connery. And it has it's got lots of these things in it about like, the evil leprechaun and different things as well. So people have this idea that all these things like the leprechaun and all these things in Irish culture are very, cheerful and joyful.
Yeah.
That stuff in Irish culture is actually quite scary.
Yeah. Ooh, yeah, I'll definitely check that out. That's one of my favorite things too, when it's meant for children, but it's horrifying. Oh, yeah. I love that.
It's definitely worth checking out. Yeah, Darby O'Gill. And there's lots of stuff on this. Like so much so that if you say to people, do you believe in the fairies and they believe in all this? People are like, nah, it's just all stories. And then you say to somebody, we have these things, what's called a fairy fort, which is like a ring in the ground. Actually like an impression of this like circle with trees in the middle of it. And you say to somebody, would you go inside that fairy fort? Oh, no. So it's really interesting that people will do that. And you say to people, spend a night in the fairy fort, and be like, no way. But on the other hand, they'll laugh and go, it's just stories for kids. So it's really interesting how, it's still on that kind of line of, I believe it, but I kind of don't believe it, but I'm not going to.
I don't want to tempt it.
I don't want to tempt it, yeah. So it is kind of interesting as well and that's kind of where my interest in horror and fiction is on those sides. If somebody wanted to start reading horror fiction today, Caitlin, and was interested in exploring more, what would you recommend? Starting with short stories or going to big novels, or how would you recommend people get into reading fiction?
Reading horror fiction. So, and I'm thinking too about contemporary horror, because I feel like contemporary horror, most people know Stephen King, I guess Anne Rice we can include in that too, but not much else sometimes. I know I found myself that way when I first wanted to really explore contemporary horror fiction. But there's a huge world out there. Really, really great stuff. There's actually a really big indie horror publishing boom right now. So there are, if you go on any book selling sites, I guess, you can find so many really great anthologies of short stories. For me, I really like finding a good novel. Some of my favorite contemporary writers I would recommend starting with, Grady Hendrix is wonderful. He does sort of horror with a dose of comedy and then like a pinch of heart, I would say. I would start with his, well, since we're talking Dracula, he has a really great book called The Southern Book Club's Guide to Hunting Vampires. And it's set in Georgia, or I think maybe North Carolina, I forget, or South Carolina, somewhere around there. And it's these housewives in the 80s, them, and Grady Hendrix pitched this book as My Mom versus Dracula. So basically Dracula moves next door to these women and they have to fight him. So that's great. Also his book, My Best Friend's Exorcism, which is also set in the 80s. And it's these two high school girls. One of them gets possessed and then the other one has to perform an exorcism. So Grady Hendrix is great. Paul Tremblay is really good. I would start with his Head Full of Ghosts, which is also a possession story. He has a really good short story collection called Growing Things as well. And then I'm also going to recommend, let me make sure I remember her name, this book called Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. It's set in the 50s, but it's a really great, especially if you're interested in 19th century Gothic stuff. Yeah. It's a really fantastic contemporary reimagination of the Gothic format and Gothic style of writing. And it's really good, really surprising explanation of the supernatural events that are happening there. To not give too much away. So that's where I would say starting, but there's so much out there right now. So you're really spoiled for choice. Sorry.
Go ahead, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry. In terms of, I was just gonna say 19th century, there's lots of, classics, I suppose. I do like Weir Mitchell, the Civil War person I was talking about before. I would also say Ambrose Bierce is really good. He's another Civil War era writer. His most famous short story is An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, which actually was turned into a Twilight Zone episode. But he has a few others. Any of his Civil War stories are wonderful. A lot of them are like about soldiers dying on the battlefield and then marching home, and then what happens to the family when their ghost son or ghost husband comes home. But he also has some about the frontier. Let me get that title. Like the damned thing is really good. So a lot like the American frontier, not knowing what's out there. The damned thing is really good. And so is the Eyes of the Panther. That's another one. Sort of has like a sort of a werewolf panther type situation going on. And I would also recommend from American Gothic literature that most people don't know of. This writer, Charles Brockton Brown. Two books. One of them is Edgar Huntly, and you actually will appreciate this. The full title is Edgar Huntly or Memoirs of a Sleepwalker. Ooh. And we actually have a not great depiction of an Irish character in here named Clitheroe.
Oh, let me guess. He's a drunk and he fights.
Pretty much.
Typical. Yeah. Did you also know on this topic that the paddy wagon? You've heard of a paddy wagon?
Oh yes.
That actually, because that actually came from New York, where
Oh, great.
that's where it came from. And it was a horse and cart originally. And they called it a paddy wagon because so many drunk Irish people were getting put into
Oh
it.
my God.
And it's still called a paddy wagon today. So, hey, I want to
Wow.
be outraged. In a world that's been
Yeah.
of outrage now, I want that cancelled.
There you go.
And
That
I want
should be,
leprechauns
honestly.
off Lucky Charms. And I want it to happen
Yes.
tomorrow, or I'm banning everybody off Twitter.
So yeah, Edgar Huntly, Memoirs of a Sleepwalker. That comes with the idea too of like, oh, if you find a guilty man sleepwalking, just follow him because his dreams will always reveal his guilt. So we have this like sleepwalking maybe murderer, and
Which is actually a sleep disorder. Did you know that?
sleepwalking.
Well, there's a whole area of where people once they're in, it's a REM behavior disorder. I recently wrote a blog on this, and it's not published. It's not publicized too well. It affects between 0.5 and 2% of the population. But some people, when they are basically in this, well, in sleepwalking, you would basically be in non-REM sleep and you'd be moving around. But in REM behavior disorder, in REM, you could be acting out your dreams. So some people have actually murdered their partner.
Whoa.
Whilst asleep.
Oh yeah, I've heard of this.
But this is actually true, and there's been court cases about it as well, where people have had no recollection of woken up and they've like the partner's been stabbed in the bed, and they're like, "What's going on here?" And the person has basically done this in the middle of the night.
That's so scary.
Yeah, or people have walked off balconies on holidays and died.
God.
Crazy, yeah. So it is actually there is again some root of that in scientific, actual fact. So that's interesting.
Yeah, so that's where I would say. Oh, and finally, also one more American 19th century recommendation. Louisa May Alcott, the writer of Little Women, also wrote a number of short stories that are very Gothic. And she actually said that her favorite, like what she writes for pleasure, was the Gothic, and that's what she sort of preferred writing. A Whisper in the Dark is my favorite one, and it's very like Bronte sister style Gothic, like the fear of getting married and like losing yourself, and but there's getting stuck in an asylum.
Caitlin, I've got one more question for you before we finish, which is kind of an interesting genre that people I've seen getting more and more popular, and I don't know if you have anything to comment on this. There seems to be an intersectionality between we'll say fiction, romance, horror, supernatural / erotic fiction happening at the moment. Why is that taken off? Like, do you know why that's so popular?
I don't know. I mean, so Nathaniel Hawthorne, who wrote The Scarlet Letter and the House of the Seven Gables back in the 19th century, he wrote a lot about like capital R romance, but I know that's different from lowercase romance or erotica. But I think there's been something sort of romantic, I guess, about the Gothic and horror from the very beginning. I watched a webinar recently on the horror-mance, which is a sort of a subgenre that they're trying to create right now. And it was a group of writers who were talking about how romance novels and horror sort of operate on similar beats, I guess, like similar, like they have, the common formula that they have to follow. And that there's like sort of a similar beats, I guess. And they were also talking about how when you're turned on and when you're scared, the body does very similar things. Like your heart beats fast, blood can rush to your face. Maybe your mind isn't working as well. So they were talking a bit about that and about like the vulnerability of like sleeping with someone or falling in love with someone, entering a relationship with someone that can be very scary. So it can lend itself to being depicted perhaps in sort of a horror realm.
Yeah, it's interesting. And the other thing that's interesting is that it's very popular on Kindle or iPad because people don't want to actually have the book cover.
Yeah, that's true.
And seriously, and I also read as well that it's actually very popular amongst men, but they don't admit it.
Wow. Yeah, I wouldn't have guessed that.
Now, I don't know the statistics, but I just read that in an article. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. But they read it on iPad. They won't actually.
So it's secret.
It's so a secret. It's like the guy beside me who was a big mining type, worker, was watching the Kardashians, one time on the piano. I was like, why are you watching? Like in my head. So I was like, are you really interested in it? Are you really interested in the fighting? Or are you just being a bit of a pervert looking at some girls? I didn't really know. Maybe it was all of the above, but he was like this watching it.
Oh my God.
And he was like about 250 pounds and 6 foot like that. And he's like,
oh my God.
It's always fascinating to know why people are interested in these things.
There's actually there was a story, what was this, back in 2018 of a Virginia congressional, I think he was running for some sort of position in Virginia, but he got caught or exposed as a Bigfoot erotica fan.
Really? I didn't know that. I didn't know that was a genre. Yeah.
I didn't know. I don't think a lot of people knew it was a thing, but there was this like brief little political scandal about this Bigfoot erotica Virginia politician. So yeah, maybe it's a big thing. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, look, you could be into a lot worse anyway. If you're not harming anybody and having fun, who cares really?
Yeah, exactly. Honestly, that's sort of fun.
People might say like, why do you watch sport or why do you do this? But
yeah,
I'll admit, actually, I'm a bit of a Bigfoot fan as well. Not the erotic part, but I went through a phase of watching all these Bigfoot documentaries.
Oh yeah.
And my wife was like, why are you wasting your time? Like, I actually don't know why. I just really like it. I think it's just a way of tuning out. So it's quite fun.
That's interesting.
Do you think maybe with the romance horror intersectionality that people, and I haven't read any of these books, I'm just kind of like spitballing here. Do you think maybe sometimes women are attracted to it because it's a man who, is a bit dark and a bit maybe evil, and they're trying to get the light and the brightness out of him, and they think that love can conquer dark? Would that be maybe kind of an underlying thing?
Maybe, like the I can fix him sort of thing. Maybe, yeah. I think too, like that, like the dangerous aspect of it too is probably a turn on. Also, like, he's a vampire, so he's a little different. He's not the other boys. There might be some of that too, I think.
Yeah. Well, I've worked with plenty of people I would describe as vampires as well. So, be careful there, people, what you wish for. So it might come true. Caitlin, this was an absolute fascinating conversation. I really liked that, and particularly because I really like going into these topics where I have no idea about the subjects, and it's great to have a conversation with you and then see the similarities and the crossover between different areas. So and the kind of the things that connects us as opposed to the things that divides us. And it's really interesting from a fiction perspective to see what we can kind of have these taglines, if you want to call them, back into science and into popular culture. So absolutely fascinating conversation. Really, really enjoyed it. And I want to just say thank you very much for your time this evening. I really, really enjoyed it. And I definitely want to talk to you again about some of this stuff. It's fascinating, and you make me quite excited. I want to quit my job and just start reading now today with this big list.
Nice.
Like, wow, I want to read all this stuff now. But this is, I get so excited about these different things. But thank you very much for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was a really fun conversation. I feel very jazzed too now, and I'm probably going to go read something right after this.
So, Caitlin, before we go, if people want to contact you, want to follow your work, maybe want to, do you still do teaching? Like, how can they get a hold of you? What do you do? What's out there on offer from you?
Yeah. So I'm not teaching right now. I've become an instructional designer. So right now my job is I'm teaching professors how to teach online.
Yep.
So a little different, but you can find me. I'm on Twitter at Kate Duffy 49. So that's CaitDuffy, and then the number 49. And yeah, besides that, I'm writing, so I'll always tweet about it as it comes out.
Excellent. We'll put all that in the show notes, but stay tuned to Caitlin for more stuff. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you.